Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bhakti Fundamentals. Today, we continue our mini-series on the topic of material nature, or Prakriti Tattva in Sanskrit. In our previous discussion on the three modes of material nature, we discussed how there are three qualities, or gunas, of material nature. And these three modes shape our behavior, actions, and thoughts. And in general, they condition us materially, which means that they influence us and train us to be comfortable with material existence in its different varieties. These modes of nature enable us to associate with matter in different ways, and as a result, we can make the mistake of believing that we are material beings rather than spiritual beings. And of course, we are spiritual beings. Therefore, we mentioned how the term guna, or quality, can also be translated as ropes, because the qualities of material nature are like ropes that bind us, spiritual beings or jivas, to matter, to the material world and material consciousness. This teaching about the three modes of material nature comes from the Bhagavad Gita. Chapter 14 of the Gita is actually entitled The Three Modes of Material Nature. And in chapter 14, verse 5, Krishna says to Arjuna, "Material nature consists of three modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. When the eternal living entities come in contact with nature, O mighty armed Arjuna, they become conditioned by these modes." And last time we looked at how that material conditioning manifests when we looked at the general characteristics of the three modes of nature. Krishna himself summarizes the general characteristics of the modes of material nature in verses 6 to 8 of chapter 14 of the Gita. He states, "O sinless one, the mode of goodness, being purer than the others, is illuminating, and it frees one from all sinful reactions. Those situated in that mode become conditioned by a sense of happiness and knowledge. The mode of passion is born of unlimited desires and longings, O son of Kunti, and because of this, the embodied living entity is bound to material, fruitive actions. O son of Bharata, know that the mode of darkness, born of ignorance, is the delusion of all embodied living entities. The results of this mode are madness, indolence, and sleep, which bind the conditioned soul." Now, in light of these descriptions of the three modes of material nature given by the Supreme himself, we can readily see that the mode of goodness is purer than the lower modes of passion and ignorance. While it's easier to see the negative aspects of the modes of passion and ignorance, and to understand how they condition us materially, it can be more difficult to see how the mode of goodness conditions us materially. After all, the mode of goodness seems, well, good. Yet we discussed how actions performed in the mode of goodness, while virtuous, still yield material karma, good karma, but material karma nevertheless. And thus, actions carried out in the mode of goodness also keep us returning to the material world so that we can reap the results of our good material actions. But there's an additional subtle aspect of material conditioning within the mode of goodness itself that we didn't touch on last week. And this particular conditioning makes those cultivating the mode of goodness feel little urgency to pursue spiritual life, to pursue Bhakti Yoga. Why? Because cultivating the mode of goodness leads to the development of qualities like peace, nonviolence, contentment, thoughtfulness, and awareness. And the contentedness one feels in their mode of goodness life, their sense of satisfaction, can reduce their inclination towards spiritual life and practices. After all, for someone who is cultivating the mode of goodness, life feels fulfilling enough, and as a result, the impulse to transcend the material world may not arise in them. They don't feel the need to change anything in their life or to develop spiritually. In other words, they have life so good that they feel they don't need spiritual life, even though they may not really know what real spiritual life is and all that it can offer them. So this is a subtle, unseen way in which the mode of goodness may condition us to material existence. Nevertheless, it still stands that the mode of goodness is a favorable mode to position ourselves in if we wish to cultivate spiritual life, because it functions rather like a springboard or launch pad into spiritual life. On its own, however, the material mode of goodness is still binding because it still involves material actions, even if the actions do seem good. So in this way, we described last time how all of the modes of material nature bind us to this material world, and at different times, different modes of nature are prominent in our lives. That's pretty interesting. Krishna states this himself in the 10th verse of chapter 14. He says to Arjuna, sometimes the mode of goodness becomes prominent, defeating the modes of passion and ignorance, O son of Bharata. Sometimes the mode of passion defeats goodness and ignorance, and at other times ignorance defeats goodness and passion. In this way, there is always competition for supremacy. Now, just how do we know which mode of nature is prominent in our lives at a given time? Well, we can recognize which mode is prominent within us by observing our mindset and activities. The qualities we display in our thoughts and behaviors serve as clear indicators of the prevailing mode of nature driving us. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada describes in his purport to this verse, therefore, one who is actually intent on advancing in Krishna consciousness or Bhakti Yoga has to transcend these three modes. The prominence of some certain mode of nature is manifested in one's dealings, in his activities, in eating, etc. All this will be explained in later chapters of the Gita. But if one wants, he can develop by practice the mode of goodness, and thus defeat the modes of ignorance and passion. One can similarly develop the mode of passion and defeat goodness and ignorance. Or one can develop the mode of ignorance and defeat goodness and passion. Although there are these three modes of material nature, if one is determined, he can be blessed by the mode of goodness. And by transcending the mode of goodness, he can be situated in pure goodness, which is called the Vasudeva state, a state in which one can understand the science of God. By the manifestation of particular activities, it can be understood in what mode of nature one is situated. Now, to begin, let's note Srila Prabhupada's important insight, that by observing someone's activities, we can discern the specific mode or combination of modes that someone is cultivating. We can also apply this principle to our own mindset and activities to discover what modes we are cultivating and are conditioned by. Already we can see that this knowledge of the modes of material nature really increases our self-awareness and also awareness of what modes of nature are influencing other people in our lives. It allows us to understand why people behave as they do. By engaging in actions aligned with particular modes, we empower these modes to exert greater influence over us. It's not that material things are higher or superior to us, the jiva or soul, but rather when we choose to falsely identify with material things, then we become conditioned or illusioned by those material things, by matter. Note also that Srila Prabhupada says that we can transcend the material mode of goodness, which is the highest of the three modes of nature, and we can do so via the spiritual practices of Bhakti Yoga. These spiritual practices elevate us to a state known as pure goodness, or Shuddha Sattva, a state from which we can perceive our true self as the soul, understand the Supreme, Krishna, and recognize and act on our eternal relationship with Him. A valuable exercise, once we know about the modes of material nature, is to observe individuals in various walks of life, world leaders, celebrities, professionals, everyone really, and then identify the modes of nature governing their actions. This isn't intended to diminish anyone. We recognize that each person is actually the spirit soul and is just covered over or conditioned by the modes of material nature. And observing the modes influencing others allows us to gain a clearer understanding of the motivations and forces shaping their behaviors. Each mode of nature brings a unique type of conditioning to any given person, subtly influencing their actions and mindset. With an understanding of the modes of nature, it becomes easier to see why things in the world are the way they are. Applying this exercise to ourselves is equally essential. By examining our own thoughts, behaviors, and actions, we can discern when the lower modes of passion or ignorance may be influencing us, and then we can make conscious efforts to elevate ourselves to the mode of goodness. From the platform of goodness, we are then better positioned to adopt the spiritual practices of Bhakti Yoga, allowing us to transcend even the material mode of goodness and reach a state of pure goodness, the Shuddha Sattva platform we referenced earlier, in which true self-realization and consciousness of the Supreme, Krishna, are achieved. This is why knowing about the modes of material nature is so important. Consider the example of morning fog lifting. As the fog dissipates, we can see more clearly and drive safely to work or school. In the same way, when we gain spiritual knowledge, our spiritual vision becomes clearer, enabling us to make informed choices about how we want to proceed in life. Rather than simply being swayed by the modes of nature, we can make conscious decisions from a foundation of spiritual knowledge, avoiding actions that may ultimately be disadvantageous for us, the Jivatma, the soul. There is an additional benefit to understanding the modes of material nature. Understanding these modes not only clarifies why people act as they do, but also empowers us to choose our association with people and environments wisely. Again, each mode of material nature, whether goodness, passion, or ignorance, brings a specific influence. And by recognizing these influences, we can make conscious decisions about where we go, who we engage with, and which activities we participate in. This spiritual discrimination allows us to choose situations that uplift us rather than entangle us, as each association with a particular person, object, or activity in the material world implicates us according to those things or persons' predominant modes. By choosing to associate with people, things, and activities aligned with the mode of goodness, we place ourselves in a more favorable position for spiritual growth. And then by aligning ourselves with those on the devotional path of Bhakti Yoga, and by engaging in practices that transcend even the material mode of goodness, we ultimately gain the strength to rise above all material conditioning and develop true spiritual independence. As Krishna states in the Gita, when someone properly sees that in all activities no other performer is at work than these modes of nature, and one knows the Supreme Lord who is transcendental to all these modes, then one attains my spiritual nature. This is an interesting verse, and it can also be confusing at first glance. After all, what does Krishna mean when he says that in all activities there is no other performer at work than these modes of nature? Well, in stating this, Krishna offers profound insight into the workings of free will under the influence of the modes of material nature. While we, as spirit souls, inherently possess free will, that free will is constrained by the material modes, goodness, passion, and ignorance, that dominate our consciousness and actions. Srila Prabhupada, in his purport, clarifies that the modes of nature are like forces acting upon us, subtly shaping our activities. Although we have the power of choice, our options and inclinations are largely guided by whichever mode or combination of modes we are situated in. For example, someone under the influence of the mode of ignorance, a drug dealer perhaps, may find it hard to act in the way someone situated in the mode of goodness naturally acts due to a lack of clarity or higher motivation. This is why Krishna states that the material modes are actually the performers of activity. While we do possess free will, by choosing to act under the influence of various modes of nature, we surrender much of our freedom to act independently. For example, someone who drinks alcohol willingly surrenders their freedom to think clearly, as that action places them under the influence of the mode of ignorance, which is deluding. By engaging in such behavior, they restrict their own capacity for clear judgment and self-control. This loss of clarity and freedom isn't externally imposed. It's a self-imposed limitation that arises from choosing an activity tied to a lower mode of nature. Each mode, whether goodness, passion, or ignorance, comes with its own set of inclinations and limitations that guide our actions and responses in life, often without us realizing it. So although we can choose our association with the various modes of nature, once bound by them, they largely dictate our behavior, subtly diminishing our capacity for true freedom. The irony is that we all seek freedom, yet by acting materially, we permit ourselves, either willingly or inadvertently by simply going with the flow, to be entangled or bound by the modes of material nature. In the pursuit of pleasure and happiness, people often engage in activities that lead to the opposite of freedom. By choosing actions influenced by the lower modes of passion and ignorance, we become entangled in habits and mindsets that cloud our clarity and restrict true autonomy. Real freedom, as we learn in the Gita, comes not from following fleeting material desires, but from consciously choosing actions that elevate us to the mode of goodness, and ultimately beyond the mode of goodness. Krishna gives us hope in the verse that we have been looking at. He says, when someone properly sees that in all activities no other performer is at work than these modes of nature, and one knows the Supreme Lord who is transcendental to all these modes, then one attains my spiritual nature. Krishna emphasizes that by gaining true knowledge of the modes of nature, we can recognize the modes' influence on us and see our actual spiritual identity and our inherent connection to Krishna, the Supreme. And ultimately, we can then rise above the powerful conditioning of the modes of nature. When we learn about the modes of material nature from the Gita, our spiritual discrimination sharpens, and we become aware that our actions are largely shaped by these modes, not by the actual us, the soul or jivatma. Once we do learn about the modes of nature, we can choose to be our best advocate, or we can sit by passively and allow the modes of material nature to run the show. One powerful way in which we can choose to be our best advocate is to take up spiritual practices like chanting the Maha Mantra. When we do this, we are then beginning to act from the platform of the soul. In carrying out spiritual activities, we are acting in our constitutional or original spiritual position. We are then acting in accordance with who we really are, the soul, and that is precisely when we begin to transcend the material modes of nature and their hold over us. Spiritual life, spiritual practices enable us to exercise our free will in a spiritually liberating way versus in a materially conditioned and binding way. So, to conclude our discussion on this important verse that we've been looking at, our free will always exists, but is restricted by the modes of material nature until we consciously align ourselves and act in accordance with the teachings of Krishna and Bhakti Yoga, which elevate us to the transcendental spiritual platform. At that spiritual stage, we experience real freedom, choosing not from conditioned material preferences, but from a position of pure spiritual awareness. And what is a benefit of acting from the spiritual platform? There are many. But Krishna states in chapter 14, verse 20, when the embodied beings are able to transcend these three modes associated with the material body, they can become free from birth, death, old age, and their distresses, and can enjoy nectar even in this life. In choosing to act spiritually, we are liberated from material consciousness even while residing in our material bodies and navigating this material world of suffering. Through spiritual practice, through the processes of Bhakti Yoga, we rise above the material modes of nature and experience a deep spiritual happiness that transcends the temporary pleasures of the material world. This is what Krishna means when he says we can enjoy nectar even in this life. And spiritual happiness is distinct from the material variety of happiness that we experience in this world, because spiritual happiness is eternal and is independent of external material conditions. It is not reliant on fleeting material sensory satisfaction, but rather flows from our connection to the Supreme. Thus, even within these material bodies, we can taste a spiritual joy and freedom beyond this material world. Srila Prabhupada writes in his purport or explanation to this verse as follows: how one can stay in the transcendental position, even in this body, in full Krishna consciousness, is explained in this verse. The Sanskrit word dehi means embodied. Although one is within this material body, by one's advancement in spiritual knowledge, one can be free from the influence of the modes of nature. One can enjoy the happiness of spiritual life even in this body, because after leaving this body, one is certainly going to the spiritual sky. But even in this body, one can enjoy spiritual happiness. In other words, devotional service in Krishna consciousness is the sign of liberation from material entanglement, and this will be explained in the 18th chapter of the Gita. When one is freed from the influence of the modes of material nature, one enters into devotional service. Bhakti Yoga is devotional service, and the activities of Bhakti Yoga free us from material entanglement. Furthermore, the transcendental level of awareness that Bhakti Yoga brings us to assures us of an eternal destination beyond this material world, the spiritual sky, Srila Prabhupada calls it. Bhakti Yoga, therefore, is both the process and the proof of liberation from matter, allowing us to live in spiritual consciousness regardless of our external physical circumstances in this world. We've talked a lot today about how the modes of material nature bind us, spiritual beings, to matter and to this material world. But let's end on a hopeful note, because the Gita's message Krishna's message is ultimately extremely hopeful. His ultimate message and promise to us is that the spiritual activities of Bhakti Yoga can easily help us to overcome the powerful influences of the modes of nature. Let's look at 3 verses that indicate same. In chapter 7, verse 14, Krishna says, "This divine energy of mine, consisting of the 3 modes of material nature, is difficult to overcome. But those who have surrendered unto me can easily cross beyond it." In chapter 14, verse 26, he says, "One who engages in full devotional service, unfailing in all circumstances, at once transcends the modes of material nature and thus comes to the level of Brahman, the spiritual platform." And in chapter 18, verse 66, Krishna states, "Abandon all varieties of religion, dharma, duty, and just surrender unto me. I shall deliver you from all sinful reactions. Do not fear." These verses reveal that Bhakti Yoga is the remedy to our association with matter. It is the ultimate all-powerful means to rise above the modes of material nature, which then grants us true and lasting liberation from material entanglement and reestablishes us in our eternal relationship with Krishna, with the Supreme. By embracing the path of Bhakti Yoga, we are no longer bound by matter, but situated in pure spiritual freedom, fully empowered to transcend the forces that otherwise bind us to this material world. Today's discussion builds upon our ongoing exploration of the vast topic of the material modes of nature. In our upcoming sessions, we'll delve even deeper into this essential subject, which provides us with insights into the world around us and the behaviors of the people within it. Stay tuned for more sessions as we continue uncovering the subtle ways in which the 3 modes influence and condition us on the material plane. And please let us know if you have questions about the 3 modes of nature that we can then answer in our future sessions on the topic. Until then, thank you for listening today, and we'll see you next time on Bhakti Fundamentals.